Okay, hi everybody. Let's continue with our series on ontological mathematics and the theory of everything, how to explain the existence of existence and the existence of the universe. Yes. So this episode, part 3, is what is a circling? Last time we discussed what a circling is, so let us continue. So what is a circling made of? It's net nothing. So net nothing, remember the existence is net nothing. That's why it exists, because it requires no effort to exist. Therefore, it exists automatically. So net nothing is a point moving about a circle, a circling. Okay. What is it made of? So here's some questions asked. Can it be made of material? So what material, though, would it be made of? How would you posit the existence of some sort of material, some sort of fundamental unit of dirt or something, some sort of fundamental unit of matter or something? So it's not actually material. It's not material. What would a fundamental unit of material be? How would it come into existence, right? There's no way to answer those questions. So a circling is actually made of thought. That's what it is. It's abstract. So each basis circling is a basis thought. That's what it is. And thought is immaterial. It's unextended substance. It is still a substance, but it's immaterial. Okay, so there's a long history in philosophy. You know, of course, if you're a scientific materialist, you think that the only things that can exist, the only substances that can exist are ones that you can feel with your hands. So, of course, you know, Plato and so many other philosophers have pointed out that there can be other existence, ENTS, besides that which you can sense with your senses, right? There are some existence which are only mental in nature, yes? And actually, those are the fundamental existence, and the rest of existence, material existence, is derived from those, yes? So thought is immaterial, thought is unextended substance, as Descartes pointed out. Okay, so how does a circling work? So here you can see that I've added now the little directional arrow to indicate that there is a point moving about this circle, yes? So how does that work? A circling works mathematically, that is to say, rationally, which simply means it traces the circle sequentially, right? So because what sufficient reason would there be for the point to move arbitrarily and randomly about the circle? How could you possibly justify that, right? There'd be no justification for that. So it simply moves, or what if this circle was a sphere, right? How would a point move around a sphere in some sort of symmetric, simplest possible motion? There'd be no way to do that. So that's why it reduces to a circle about a point, you know, this monad. And so it moves sequentially about this circle, and since it moves sequentially about this circle, that automatically means that it's moving mathematically about this circle from one point to the next. Numbers are naturally embedded in that process, yes, which we will see. Now here's a fun idea, which this isn't actually discussed in the Mike Hockney books, but I've just thought of this to present it because it's kind of a neat thought. So the principle of sufficient reason. If a circle can be traced in one direction, right, and reduced to net nothing and therefore exist automatically, then the circle should also be able to be traced in the other direction, right? So you see the arrow here is rotating in the opposite direction, right? So why doesn't that exist? And maybe it should and does. And, you know, there's kind of a lot of references to such concepts as sort of two worlds. You know, a lot of people talk about there being two worlds, you know, one upside down relative to the other. You see this in media. You see this, for example, in that recent King Kong versus Godzilla movie. There was two worlds which are upside down relative to each other that King Kong traversed between. There's also people talking about two different, well, you just see it come up a lot. And maybe that's what this corresponds to. Maybe it's two different universes or something like that. Maybe it's matter versus antimatter, right? Maybe one direction makes matter, the other direction makes antimatter. Maybe they exist in opposite universes. They come together, annihilate each other or something. Here's a funny phrase from a song, which is actually a bit of a lewd song, if you understand what the meaning of it is. Clowns to the left, jokers to the right of me. Maybe it's something like that, stuck in the middle with you. The band is Steeler's Wheel, that song. So Steeler's Wheel, what does that make sense? Well, Steeler's Wheel doesn't make any sense. Those are just two words together that sound funny. Well, make it make sense. So if you make it make sense, then you say it wheel stealers. So wheel stealers, well, that's odd. What does that mean? This is a wheel. Something to do with stealing each other's wheels or something like that, stealing energy, eating each other's energy, consuming it. As you can see, I've gone down some pretty crazy and deep rabbit holes, and you know, well, it gives me the ability to speculate on things that you know, most people would never come into contact with. Anyway, so who knows what the meaning of it is, but I think the principle of sufficient reason justifies that if a circle can be traced in one direction, it should be able to be traced in the other direction as well. And this might make sort of two different quasi-substances, derivative substances or something. Anyway, kind of an aside, but something to think about. Maybe it relates into some esoteric literature in some place somewhere. Okay, so what does a circling move through or in? Okay, so does a circling move through space? Well, no, we're not at the point of having space yet in space-time yet. We're just talking about logical, abstract concepts which exist in the singularity as thought, right? They don't exist anywhere. We're not talking about a circle that moves through space. There's no space. It's a circle that moves through thought. That's what it is. It's mentally based. Remember, this is idealism, right? So this circle is traced in thought, not in space. It's traced abstractly in thought. That's where it is. That's where it exists. That's where base existence is in the singularity. There's no movement in space like you would normally think of, Newtonian movement or something like that, you know, movement of a planet about a star. Not like that, although it's abstractly like that, although it's a perfect circle, not an ellipse in the case of, you know, planets. So it's abstract movement in thought, in the singularity. That's where it exists. And so does it move through? It moves through thought. And what aspect of thought? Numbers. It moves through numbers, all possible numbers given a circling's radius. Okay, and we'll see the equation for this up in a few slides here. Okay, so what are all possible numbers to move through? It's the complete and consistent closed algebraic set, which is the complex number plane. Evenly and symmetrically as a circle, of course, evenly and symmetrically, because that's the only logically justified way to do it. Why would it move arbitrarily through a plane or through the complex numbers? Okay. So the complete and consistent closed algebraic set. So that's important because it gets around then Gödelian incompleteness and incompleteness theorems. You have a complete closed set of numbers where no contradictions can self-manifest in ontological mathematics. It's a complete, closed, self-consistent set. Any algebraic operation can be translated to any other algebraic operation. You never encounter paradox or contradiction. Remember, I talked about paradox and contradiction in my last book, Planet Wars, how important it is that those actually don't exist. Paradoxes and contradictions do not actually exist in fundamental nature, in reality. There's always a resolution to them, and it's important to understand. And of course, in the examples from my book, I talked about how the resolution is always found in mathematics, which is such a wonderful and meaningful result, which, of course, scientists and philosophers don't really want to recognize or appreciate. Okay, so what are all possible numbers? Yes, okay, the complex number plane, great. So here's a convention. So normally we talk about the complex number plane as having an imaginary axis and a real axis. So the imaginary numbers are sort of just an accident of history of the way that mathematics was developed. Because we had real numbers, the way that we were thinking of numbers like positive integers corresponded to things that we could count in nature, right? Like you had one apple, you had two apples, you had three apples. So when you had algebraic solutions to other problems where you have this so-called imaginary number, then it was like, well, how does that correspond to an apple, right? So anyway, they just created this term, imaginary numbers, for numbers which involve the square root of a negative number, right? These numbers aren't invalid. They're not imaginary in the sense of being totally abstract. They're just as real. This is the point. Imaginary numbers, which are simply the square root of a negative number, are just as quote unquote real. You see how the language is so confused because now I'm using words that sort of are the same word but mean different things, right? They're real numbers, but I'm not but I'm not talking about the real axis. I'm talking about numbers as in ontological, right? They're all ontological. I should use that term. So imaginary numbers, which are the square root of a negative number, are just as ontological, that means corresponding to existence and what exists, as what we call real numbers. Okay, so in that sense, they're all real. You see the difficulty. So we need a whole new convention, actually. We need to actually rename our numbers. This is something that I have some notes on about renaming our number system. It'd be really good to do that and get rid of this term imaginary. So the Hockney books, the God series books, have done this somewhat. So the imaginary numbers are actually temporal numbers. That means time. Imaginary numbers actually correspond with time. It's really, really cool. And you can do some really, really great science and physics with that. by recognizing that imaginary numbers. What do they mean? You have this complex number. You have this complex number plane. Well, so it turns out that the spatial numbers, numbers that correspond to distances in space, are the one axis, and then numbers that correspond to distances in time are then the imaginary axis. And with that, you can do some really, really fantastic, important, fundamental things in physics. Really fantastic. So the new convention is real numbers. What we used to call real numbers are now going to be called spatial numbers. And what we used to call imaginary numbers are simply now going to be called temporal numbers or time numbers, okay? And then any number in general is complex, although, most of the time we deal just with, spatial numbers or real numbers for measuring, distances and quantities in space, yes? So very important. The square root of negative numbers now become they're the imaginary axis. It's actually the time axis. It's the time axis of space-time, okay? So this complex number plane is actually the space-time grid. It's actually the space-time grid, okay? Presented very simply here in only one dimension, of course, one dimension in space and then one dimension in time. Not that time is multiple dimensions. It's just that there's a corresponding temporal axis to each spatial axis, but the temporal axes all sort of reduced to a single time axis, yes? Okay, great. So very important that. Now, what is a circling going on? So what is a circling? So a circling it's a basis thought. It's a mathematical object. It's imbued with mathematics and mathematical properties because it has a radius, it has a frequency, it's moving at a certain radius, and it's moving sequentially. So these are things which simply have numbers imbued in them, yes? It's immaterial and unextended. This isn't a circle that's happening in space. It's happening mentally, right? It's happening in the singularity, which is net nothing, right? So it's nothing, but it's something, right? So it's kind of both. It's nothing, but it's also something with internal properties. Well, how can that possibly exist as an extended thing? Well, it can't really, so it all exists in the singularity as thought. It's basis thought, okay? So it's a frequency, it is a number, right? It's a frequency of a given number, and it's motion, and lo and behold, here, it's energy. This is what energy is. So for the first time in scientific history, we have now defined energy. Now, this is extremely important because if you ask, for example, today's scientific materialists, what they're studying, say in quantum mechanics, and it's all about fundamental particles. You ask them what a fundamental particle is, and they just, assume that, well, it's just a fundamental particle. It just exists. Well, of course, that's not a sufficient answer. Yeah. So you ask them, well, what really is it? And then maybe you can get some physicists to say that, oh, well, it's energy. But once you hit energy, no physicist, no scientist in the world anywhere that has ever happened has ever defined what energy actually is. They just take it as some quantity that they don't really understand, but it's something that conveniently and mysteriously they can do mathematics with, right? Well, here in our system, of course, mathematics is identified with energy. It's one and the same thing. It's abstract. It exists in the mental singularity. And we'll see later on how it actually can produce space-time from a mental singularity. You can produce space-time out of this. I think that's going to be the next part. So in any case, it is energy. For the first time in scientific history, we have defined energy. I don't know if you'll appreciate how groundbreaking and how profound and amazing this is, but we have just done something here which has never happened before in the entire history of the world, and certainly not in the history of modern science for the last 100, 200 years. Yes? So this is what energy is. A circling is basis energy. Energy comes in frequencies, right? And so a single instance of a circling, one single circle is circling, is a given frequency, is a given energy, amount of energy. Yes? Fantastic. That's what energy is. What you'll get from scientists at most is you might get them to admit that energy is an abstract concept, but at that point, of course, the scientific materialist mind shuts down and they don't know where to go. Well, for us, that's totally fine because everything is abstract ultimately in the sense of being ideal, as in existing mentally in a mental singularity. So we have totally just defined energy. Now, yes, it's exactly what it is an abstract concept. It's an abstract movement in the singularity, right? Which base existence has to be made out of. Fantastic. I hope you can appreciate with me right now just how fantastic this is. It's really, really fantastic. So what is the mathematical form then of this? The general form is Euler's equation, which is called also the God equation in the Hockney material. The God equation. Why the God equation? Well, because it's self-existent existence. And that's what we've always defined what God is, right? So it's the God equation. So here's the general form of the equation. R is the scaling factor, or sorry, R, yeah, would be the radius of the circle, and then e to the I, and then this is the frequency and some phase. So that gives you your, well, these terms, your cosine and your sine term. Right, so you have R cosine frequency times a phase shift plus I sine times frequency and a phase shift, yes? So that's the God equation. Here's a simpler form of it. E to the ix equals cosine x plus I sine x. So that's just with R equals 1 and just simplifying some of these terms just so you can see what the equation looks like a little bit more simply. E to the ix equals cosine x plus I sine x, yes? So that is what a given instance of a circling is. That's what one circling is. It has a radius, and it has a frequency, and it's going around like this, and it is perfectly described. This is moving through the complex number plane. As you can see, cosine is the movement through the real numbers, the cosine term, and the sine term is the movement through the imaginary numbers, the temporal and spatial numbers. Of course, the temporal numbers being the imaginary, the I numbers, and the cosine term being the spatial numbers. And you can see this in this little diagram here. As this point moves about the circle, how you get these frequencies, these waves in space, which is a cosine term, and a wave in time, which is the sine term, right? So here's the mental, the abstract circling, which is the net nothing over a cycle, which is what existence is fundamentally made out of, because this reduces to a net nothing over a full cycle, which means that it automatically exists with no impetus. Nothing is required. No outside force is required to create this. It is simply self-existent because it reduces to nothing. And all forms of nothing must exist via the principle of sufficient reason. And so this movement about the circle creates a frequency in space and a frequency in time. See that? Wonderful. That's what it is. Now, here's some really cool stuff, and we'll get more into this in a future part. But what's really cool is that relativity may be derived with this equation and its interpretation of temporal and spatial components. So if you use this diagram, the complex number plane, but you interpret it as space and time, you can derive relativity theory from this, special relativity from this, right? From the Euler's equation. Really cool. But you know what else you do with Euler's equation? Euler's equation is also the basis of the Fourier transform, which itself is then the basis of quantum mechanics and thermodynamics. You see what just happened there? I'll get into more detail in this in a future part, but I hope you can see what just happened there. We have the basis of relativity theory in Euler's equation, and we have the basis of quantum mechanics and thermodynamics in Euler's equation. Okay? What does that mean? It means that the unification of physics, of all the fields and forces of physics, is now going to be built in. We're going to get into that in a future part, but it's really, really fantastic and exciting. We're learning some really, really fantastic things here. Hope you can see that. Okay, so the next part, that was it. So the next part is then going to be monads and the singularity, how to create a universe. So we'll get into a little bit more math. Of course, I don't want to talk about too much math and make it too, just a discussion of math and equations. That gets a little bit boring. But I will present some, and it's going to be really fun. Monads and the singularity. How does the singularity create space-time? That's what we're going to discuss next. What math exists, and how can you build space-time, space and time and matter, out of a singularity of all possible frequencies? It's really quite cool, and you're going to see how easy it is. All right. Have a good day. Good talking to you. Bye-bye.